So recently, Bernie Sanders came out with another great idea, and this time it is to put an end to medical debt, to eliminate medical debt. And the article here that I'm going to read from you guys, it's a short one. It's from Reuters.com. And the title of the article says, Bernie Sanders proposes canceling $81 billion in U.S. medical debt. So all the debt that people have racked up from, whatever kind of, healthcare costs they've had to pay, that's something that Bernie Sanders wants to address. And it's the perfect thing, coupled with is his idea of canceling student debt, and then obviously, pushing for, other essentially policies, but that specifically these are debt related issues. But pushing for any kind of ideas that help people that are, poor, middle class, that have to pay all this money for their medical costs, and in the other case, student debt costs. These people can't afford this kind of debt, and Bernie Sanders wants to cancel it. And that is a very valiant and wonderful thing for him to do. It's a progressive thing for him to do, and it's great for him to do that. And I think it's gonna go over very very positively among the left wingers in this country. So let me read different parts of this article here, and then we'll discuss it as we go along. So it says, U.S. presidential contender Bernie Sanders proposed a plan on Saturday to cancel $81 billion in existing past due medical debt for Americans, but offered no details on how it would be financed. Well, it's going to be It's most likely going to be financed through taxing. I would say probably taxing Wall Street, taxing big corporations. Well, in the case of taxing Wall Street, it's essentially to tax trade. So different like stock trade. So if you make a transaction, essentially, you make a transaction on Wall Street, that's going to be charged. So that's how he wants to fund student loan debt, and then canceling student loan debt. So I'm guessing he's probably going to do the same thing when it comes to medical debt. So my assumption is that he's probably going to give more details later on, and this is kind of just like a precursor to what he's eventually going to do. And he's going to end up when he gives more of the details, he's going to add it to his platform. So continues on here. It says, Sanders, an independent U.S. senator from Vermont, said in a statement that under his plan, the government would negotiate and pay off past due medical bills that have been reported to credit agencies. The proposal, he said, would also repeal some elements of the 2005 bankruptcy reform bill and allow other existing and future medical debt to be discharged. Quoting him here, it says, in the United States of America, your financial life and future should not be destroyed because you or a member of your family gets sick, said Sanders. That is unacceptable. I am sick and tired of seeing over 500,000 Americans declare bankruptcy each year because they cannot pay off the outrageous cost of a medical emergency or a hospital stay. And then it continues on here. It's saying, according to Sanders, medical debt is the leading cause of consumer bankruptcy, with more than 500,000 Americans filing due to medical expenses each year. Wow, that's huge. He said the 2005 bankruptcy reform bill made it difficult to discharge medical debt by imposing strict means tests and eliminated fundamental consumer protections for Americans. It also trapped families with medical debt in long-term poverty, mandated that they pay for credit counseling before filing for bankruptcy, and increased the need for expensive legal services when filing a case for medical bankruptcy, the senator said. So that was a quote from that last part. So that's, that's obviously a great thing. Bernie Sanders is not somebody that wants to, as many of you know, and he's said before, many of his supporters have repeated this, but he's not in favor of any middle ground. He doesn't want to push for any kind of middle ground policies. And this is a speech he gave in California. I believe it was the California Democratic Convention, I believe. This was a couple of months ago. I covered it for my podcast. But he went out there and he said, no middle ground, no middle ground. He said on every single issue, no middle ground. And when it comes to an issue like this, when it comes to an issue, as I said before, student loan debt, there is no middle ground. And when it comes to Medicare-for-all, when it comes to specifically paying for healthcare, for the healthcare for Americans, no middle ground. When it comes to living wage, no middle ground. Bernie Sanders wants to do everything to push the spectrum, the political spectrum of this country, as far left as he can. Because right now, our political spectrum is so far right. It's just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, just take the idea of the fact that we are in 8 different wars right now. We are in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, Syria. What's the other one I'm missing? Syria. Niger was the 8th one I was going to say, but there's another one before that. I'm missing one of them. See, it's so many you can't even keep track of them. It's so hard to count all these countries, and I hope, God forbid, Iran doesn't get added onto that list under a Trump administration, but that's just one example of how our political spectrum is so far to the right, because this whole mentality of like, oh yeah, it's totally cool that we're in 8 different wars. Who cares? Big deal. It's not that big. We got to go and fight the terrorists. So the mentality of the people in this country is that pushing for right-wing ideas like wars, like, cutting taxes. Oh, how are you going to pay for things? But then you can go and pay for all the tax breaks that you're going to give to the millionaires and the billionaires. That's perfectly okay. But when you want to go and, for example, cancel medical debt, or you would cancel student loan debt, that's like ridiculous. Oh my God, that is terrible. That is such a radical and outrageous idea to come up with. Even though it's literally going to help millions upon millions of people who are suffering from that debt. Now you can make the case that okay, maybe people shouldn't have gotten into debt in the first place, but that's ridiculous, because the reason people are in debt is because the creditors, they give loan this money to these to regular people out there. They end up charging them so fucking high in interest rates that people aren't able to pay them off. And I mean, what do you think was one of the reasons why the subprime mortgage crisis started and the Great Recession? Because people were given toxic loans and then they weren't able to pay them off because the interest rates were so high, and they had to pay off so much fucking money that it was unaffordable. They just couldn't do it anymore. Can you blame them? I mean, can you blame people for not being able to pay off the additional money in interest rates that that these banks are charging them, and these essentially these loan sharks and stuff? I mean, it's really just the mentality of people in this country, and I'm talking about specifically rich, I'm talking about politicians, I'm talking about media figures. I mean, just look at how terrible our media is. Look at the kind of questions our media asks, as we just covered with the debate. I mean, the kind of mentality that the super rich and the elitist in this country have is so unbelievably obscene and disgusting, and they don't get called out for it. They don't get called out for pushing for things that honestly are ridiculous, and that people in other countries would be just like, what is going on? How are Americans living like this when they can't even pay off student loans, let alone the fact that they even have to pay student loans? The fact that they have to pay that back. They don't just get a free education like you do in all the European countries, Scandinavia, to some extent Canada, UK. Yeah, same with debt. Medical debt. Same exact thing. Like, medical bankruptcy shouldn't even be a fucking issue. In every other industrialized country and every other industrialized nation, it is not an issue. It is an issue in this nation, in this country. And that is a fucking travesty. And that should not be something that people just like ignore and put off to the side and be like, oh, well, big deal, whatever. And the fact, and believe it or not, there are people that are like considered like regular people like you and me, and they, whether they're on the Republican side or Democratic side, they see that as like, oh, well, you know, whatever, tough break. That's what you got to deal with. That's life. Like they literally look at it like that. But then these are also the people that talk about, oh, well, yeah, I'm totally in favor of universal health care. But then when you see a candidate like Bernie Sanders, who is the only politician pushing for a legitimate universal health care, single-payer system, whenever they see somebody like that pushing for it, they're like, oh, ew, I can't stand him. He's too radical. He's too far left. He's too left-wing. He's too, whatever. And then you have to ask right-wingers, too communist. He's a communist. He's a socialist. He's a Marxist. I mean, it's just, it goes on and on and on with the stupidity of people that just are out of touch. And in reality, they're actually living life just like every other regular human being is out there, where they have debt and they have medical. They're getting to medical bankruptcy or just regular bankruptcy in general. You know, they're living. A lot of people are living on the street. You know, living paycheck to paycheck. You know, they're making less than $30,000 a year, which is 75. I think 3/4 of Americans in this country are making less than $30,000 a year. I mean, that's crazy. That is an unbelievable statistic. And the people that are calling themselves quote unquote Democrats that let that go by and just pretend as if it's nothing, I don't know. How are you a Democrat? But see, that's the problem. The spectrum of this country has tilted, not even tilted, it's just completely done a complete, I don't know, just it's overturned. It's a complete 180 to become so right-wing that right-wing ideas are considered in some cases like not liberal, but they're considered like democratic ideas, you know? So like, for example, if you want to take the issue of like immigration, so, oh yeah, let's put up a border wall. Like, so like, you know, what's his name, Donald Trump, obviously, you know, he wants to do a border wall. Democrats, their idea, their response is, okay, fine, we'll do the border wall, but give more protections to, you know, immigrants that are captured in detention centers, for example. Of course, they don't end up making that happen, but that's what they want. And then obviously Trump doesn't give them the protections for the immigrants that are kept in detention centers and kids that are kept in cages. But my point is that Democrats still are pushing for a border wall. So a border wall is not going to stop people from coming over. That's not how it works, you know. More, you know, ICE agents going and, you know, just raiding somebody's house, you know, raiding the house of an immigrant that, you know, apparently is in the United States illegally. Apparently that's a wonderful thing, and they do wonderful work. But let's just not fund them as much. You know what I'm saying? Like, in the idea of neoliberals and corporate Democrats, they feel the need, like, oh, we should just slightly, you know, but slightly fund these agencies less, you know. Or let's just get out of Afghanistan. So when it comes to foreign policy, let's just get out of Afghanistan and maybe Iraq, but that's it. So like in their mind, no, let's keep bombing Syria, let's keep bombing Yemen, let's keep bombing, you know, Pakistan, Somalia, you know, Niger, whatever. Like the idea of the kind of typical neoliberal politicians or even voters out there, you know, corporatist, pro-democrat voters out there, is to support policies that are just not far left enough, when in reality you should, because our country and our spectrum is so far to the right. So you should support the policies that are further left. Like I said before, when it comes to Medicare-for-all, you should support a policy that is as far left to as possible, so that maybe you can get a better middle ground, you know, so that instead of pushing for what is the actual middle ground, so instead of pushing for middle ground, you will get an actual, you know, at best, if you push for the furthest left policy, maybe you'll actually get that middle ground. Instead of pushing for the middle ground and then fighting against the right wingers and then pushing for a middle ground, well, then you'll end up, you know, in that way, you'll end up getting like still a right wing policy essentially. So at least if you push for the furthest right policy, you might actually get the actual middle ground. So obviously a lot of Democrats, corporatists, you know, neoliberals don't get this mentality, you know, this strategy, this mentality does not register in their minds. They don't get that. They don't get that you need to go out there and advocate for the policies that you believe in the most. And instead of believing when people say, oh, this is fairy dust and unicorns and, you guys just want a bunch of ponies and stuff. Like, no, we're pushing for policies that are going to help people live their life, not going bankrupt, not dying, being able to survive without having to, essentially live on the street. So you can actually live in a home and sleep in your own bed at night. Especially if you have kids, be able to raise your kids right, And these are basic things, again, that exist in other industrialized nations, not in this nation. In this nation, we are forced to accept the fact that we all have to suffer suffer under the reign of corporate oligarchs and plutocrats who are super fucking rich and have to keep getting their tax cuts as we fucking don't get shit. We don't get nothing. We don't even get breadcrumbs. We're the ones who are supposed to suffer as they're the ones that are thriving and living their lives wonderfully. And that's terrible. That is not something that should exist in this country. It's shameful. It's shameful that is the way that we are living in this country. And until you have somebody like Bernie Sanders and politicians out there like himself, getting into office that are pushing for those things, until we have those people getting in there and existing in our political landscape, then we're not going to get anywhere. And we're going to stay stuck where we are, and we're going to keep having Trump, or even possibly get even somebody worse than Trump, which is almost unimaginable. But if that's what people want, if they want more Trump, then they should go and support somebody that is not Bernie Sanders. And trust me, that's what they're doing. They're going out and supporting anyone that's not Bernie Sanders out there because they think that Bernie Sanders is too radical. We're talking about Democrats here. So it's unbelievable how these people think, and I'm never going to understand it. And progressives out there, we have to fight tooth and nail to make sure these kind of things are going to happen, and if we don't, we're going to end up getting nowhere in this country.